Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. It is my pleasure today to introduce Jane Goulding and Ryan Jones, both from the New Zealand Evidence-Based Policing Centre. And today they are going to be presenting about the methamphetamine in New Zealand research program. Jane Goulding has been a senior advisor in the Research Insights team at the Evidence-Based Policing Centre for the past 4 years. She has had a varied background, but she was one of the 2 inaugural Master of Forensic Psychology students at Victoria University of Wellington and has spent a number of years as a researcher in the public sector. Ryan Jones has also worked within the Research Insights team at the Evidence-Based Policing Centre, and he's been there since 2019, and he's currently acting as Senior Advisor, and he also has a background in forensic psychology. So again, it is my pleasure to introduce both Ryan and Jane today, and I will hand over the floor to them. So as we go, please feel free to pop questions in the chat, and we can have a bit of a Q&A towards the end.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so as April said, today we are going to be talking about the methamphetamine in New Zealand research program. So this program of work was initially established in 2020 by New Zealand Police. And really the goal, or sort of inciting incident, I suppose, for this is to try and provide a more solid evidence base for the harm caused by methamphetamine in New Zealand communities. Methamphetamine is quite a significant harm, and it's got quite a high street value, so it's making it quite a desirable sort of target for both local, sort of national and international organised crime groups. The program is led by New Zealand Police, and specifically EBPC, although we also have a steering group with representatives from both government agencies as well as non-government agencies, universities in New Zealand and Australia, and iwi, who have oversight and sort of provide guidance on the direction of the research and helping us to best put it all together. The program as a whole is predominantly 3 sort of main, I guess, sort of stages of work. The first one was a stock take of predominantly grey literature relevant to the New Zealand context, so provided by our steering group members. The second stage was an examination of police data specifically to try and look at what were the associations between methamphetamine and crime. There is a part of that also a collaboration that we have done with the University of Otago, the ones based in Canterbury, but using the Christchurch Health and Development Study. And then the final sort of part of where we are hoping to go is a more sort of qualitative piece, working with communities and individuals and getting more sort of these stories about the lived experiences of methamphetamine, about how communities are working to address methamphetamine in their communities. Ask Jane.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. Let's try that. As Ryan said, we're very much talking about what has been and what is to come in the meth program. So the first cab off the rank is really the first product we actually. The first product we produced was the what is currently known about the meth in New Zealand and the harm it causes. So this is a comprehensive, though not exhaustive, stock take of what at the time was already known about the harm caused to communities in New Zealand by meth, whilst observing information gaps and proposing areas for further research. As Ryan notes, it is mostly grey literature based, and it came about simply to understand what we already knew and what we needed to know, given the breadth of knowledge across the steering group. So steering group members were asked to provide relevant literature and reports from their agencies and associated organisations to inform the stocktake, and in all, approximately 167 documents went into making this reasonably weighty booklet. It's also available online. So I'm just going to quickly summarise some of the key findings from this work with a couple of caveats. It is focused on answering the question, what is known about the harm of methamphetamine? So if there is literature regarding any possible benefits, obviously it's not included. Also, it is current at around 2020, so there are some areas where there may have been change. So given that, starting off with people who use meth and what we know, at a national level, since wastewater testing began, meth has been detected in wastewater for every community tested every day of the week in New Zealand. Now, we have a very high national uptake of meth use. However, it does vary quite a lot per capita. For example, the Northland profit is generally around 5 times higher in consumption than the Southern District. At the time of publication of this book, and as I say, this was finished around 2020, published 21, we were consuming around 14.1 kilograms per week as a nation. For context, last year in Q2, it was around 16, and this year it is around 13 kilograms per week. When wastewater drug testing was compared across countries, we ranked 4th highest behind the United States, Australia, and the Czech Republic. So we're kind of pushing above our weight. At an individual level, what we see is a fairly typical progression of use from social user to dependency. People who begin using meth, generally it's a spur of the moment or introduction by friends. Most report having very little knowledge about the harm meth causes before using it. Use has continued due to sociability factors, lowered appetite's a big one. And then has continued on due to boredom, lack of routine, trying to capture the initial high and avoiding the effects of coming down. Now, some people at this point do reduce use, usually because of the negative side effects, such as losing connection with others, financial instability, as well as, a huge, as you can see from the slide, a huge array of possible negative impacts at an individual level. However, for a large number, this process becomes chemical dependency. And at that point, this is where we often see meth users turn to crime or become a victim of crime and violent behaviour. In regards to people who have other associations with meth, such as dealers and cooks, the motivations they have given were ensuring they had methamphetamine for themselves, making money, enjoying the lifestyle, coercion, and financial difficulties. In regard to production, importation, and distribution, it seems that domestic production of methamphetamine in New Zealand is decreasing, but consumption is remaining constant. The volume of meth has generally increased, imported into New Zealand has generally increased since 2012, with a small interruption from COVID, which made it difficult to get and rather expensive. However, that was not a long-term disruption. Intelligence Holdings describes that the importation of precursors to manufacture methamphetamine is also an emerging trend. In regards to our biggest suppliers, the most important syndicates are from Mexico and the Golden Triangle, and they're our primary suppliers to the New Zealand market, and they often have relationships with domestic gangs for this reason. Meth has also been increasingly available online as well, and the purity of meth sold in New Zealand at this time was considered very high at 74% and very easy to obtain. Okay, moving on to prevention. Now, this is an area where the information provided for this document was limited, and it's probably an area that requires its own stock take. As we know, there are different initiatives in New Zealand. But in regards to harm reduction, New Zealand strategies include the Needle Exchange Program, High Alert website, festival drug checking, and drug and meth health initiatives. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. And a common outcome measure of treatment includes harm reduction as well as abstinence, but there is no national standardised outcome evaluation system for addiction. In regards to withdrawal management and treatment, there are three main types, which are brief intervention, community-based outpatient, and residential programs. Withdrawal is usually supported in an outpatient setting since symptoms are not life-threatening. But there are quite significant barriers to treatment in New Zealand. They can be individual, such as problem denial, the positive effects of the drug, peer pressure, not having enough information about treatment options, perceived inability to actually be able to stop, belief that they do not deserve to recover, shame, stigma, and a lack of trust. There are also system-level barriers such as unavailability of services, funding scarcity, lack of resources, limited hours of service, limited awareness of service, and a number of cases, considerable distance between services available and client. Now, moving on to crime, which I'll only briefly touch on because that's more Ryan's sphere. The data we have in this stock take comes largely from corrections in regards to the association between meth use and crime in the prison population, so not highly generalisable. But in this data, we see that methamphetamine use and methamphetamine criminal charges are associated with violent offending, domestic violence, acquisitive crimes, road policing incidents, and money laundering. And in 2019, it was estimated that the biggest groups laundering money domestically were associated with drug offending, and that they were costing the country around $1.35 billion annually. Now, I just want to say in association with crime, there's a lot of underlying factors and behaviours which are common between the predictors of the likelihood of being a drug user and the likelihood of committing a crime. So it is, so it's likely that these common determinants are impacting both these likelihoods at once. However, just, it has to be said, because meth use and crime, though, as you see from Ryan's work, are highly connected, there is no obvious causation in this. In regards to the research gap, obviously what we knew was a lot. There were a number of things that did come up as gaps, but the two most significant ones were a lack of personal insight and experience from a New Zealand context. At the time, we had very little in terms of the New Zealand voice and the meth experience. The other thing was further work into understanding methamphetamine trajectories and the association between crime and harm. And that takes us to Ryan's.
Perfect. So yeah, as mentioned, so this next section is more about the sort of analysis we conducted specifically of police data. This stage of the research was itself split into three different sort of stages. The idea was that in conjunction with our steering group, as we were sort of doing the work, making findings, we could share it with them, and that could again help sort of direct or guide as required. The first part of analyses that we did was looking at a comparison between a cohort of individuals with methamphetamine offences and a cohort of offenders without methamphetamine offences. The second stage was looking at whether the methamphetamine cohort were all committing the same types of offences or whether there were different patterns of behaviour. And the third part was more descriptive, but looking at sort of trajectories and trends over time for a subset of the cohort. And as I mentioned again earlier, I will also talk a little bit about some of the supplementary work that was completed by the University of Otago and this Christchurch Health Development Study data, which does sort of help fill in some of the gaps and limitations that police data has. So as an overview of this data, the data set comprised about 56,000 people. Of those, 28,634 were our methamphetamine offenders. This is not specifically people who have used methamphetamine, but it's people who police had sufficient evidence to be able to charge for some type of methamphetamine-related offence. So things like possessing methamphetamine or dealing. So it does have a little limitation in that yeah, we're not talking about people actually necessarily using and that being a contributing factor. And then our comparison group, about 27,733 people who, again, police have no record or evidence to suggest that they have engaged with methamphetamine. They possibly could have, but police at least don't have evidence to be able to charge or make that call. In terms of how the comparison group was created, it was a random stratified sample and made so that the proportion of the offenders in this group per sort of police district was sort of roughly the same as the methamphetamine offenders, and that was largely based on the relative amount of methamphetamine used in each police district, identified through the wastewater analyses that have been conducted over the years by ESR. In terms of the variables that we had in police data, it's quite limiting, but it was a lot around sort of things like the gender, the ethnicity of the individual that is recorded, how old were they when they first came into police contact, how long have they, I guess, been in the police system, and whether they were on the national gang list that police hold. We also used and measured crime harm using the crime harm index, which is based on sentencing data that sort of gives a equivalent number of prison days that an individual might have gotten for a first-time offence. So it's sort of a proxy measure to try and give an idea of how harmful, at least as a society, do we view particular types of offences. So the first sort of the main analysis with the comparison group and the meth cohort. So for this, it was decided in conjunction with our steering group that we would use stepwise multivariate regressions. This method does have some sort of criticisms, predominantly around how variables are included into the models, and that it's purely statistical, so researchers do not have as much sort of influence or decision making in terms of what should be included. But we decided this was the most appropriate approach, given the first limiting number of variables that we had, also that we didn't really have any theoretical basis or idea of which variables would be important in this models and the order that they should be included. The primary sort of statistic that I will talk about is called an incident rate ratio. Basically, it's reflecting the difference between the methamphetamine group, the comparison group. If there is a incident rate ratio of 1, that's sort of meaning that there isn't a difference between the groups. If the value was less than 1, that would be the comparison group higher on something. And if it was above 1, then indicating that the methamphetamine cohort is higher. So on this table, I've just included some of the more important sort of differences. We'll note that as the analysis as a whole found that the methamphetamine cohort for every type of offence committed that far more, that was far more harmful, and they were also far more victimised for each. But in particular, ones that came quite strongly across were related to things like theft, burglary, and robbery, which are around sort of 8 times more offences committed by the methamphetamine cohort in the comparison cohort for those ones, and roughly the harm is sort of between sort of 7 to sort of 9.5 sort of times that of the comparison group for those ones. Fraud was another quite high one, and around sort of 9 times more offences committed. Prohibited weapons around 10 times more. And then illicit drugs was also very, very high. The row there has got 2 different numbers. Specifically, it's the number outside of the bracket is if methamphetamine offences themselves were included in the drug category, and then in the bracket is when those were removed. So even with meth offences not being included in the analysis, it's still sort of showing that the methamphetamine cohort as a whole was still involved quite heavily in other types of drugs as well, which was predominantly cannabis. And then the other point to note on this slide is in terms of the victimisation. So again, the methamphetamine cohort, not only are they offending far more, they were also far more victimised in, again, every category. In terms of the Christchurch Health and Development Study data, there were multiple reports completed, but I'll just talk about one main one and how it sort of more fits into what I've just sort of talked about. So within the study, individuals are followed from birth in the 70s up until I think the last follow-up was when they were aged 40. And these individuals in the study, while methamphetamine use wasn't particularly high, it was high enough for the team to be able to do some statistics, and predominantly finding that so individuals who reported using methamphetamine either casually or regularly, with regular being defined as at least once every week. So these people were reporting higher levels of offending, particularly theft or burglary, assault, use of a weapon, property damage and vandalism, or fraud, than the people in the Christchurch study who did not use methamphetamine. They also looked at testing the association between methamphetamine use and offending itself and seeing whether there was any evidence that could suggest a potential causal link. I first did that just with those variables on their own and found, yes, there was an association between them, but then further tested that and found that the association remained even when accounting for variables that could have made exposure to methamphetamine more likely, sort of family functioning or personality related variables, that type of thing, as well as variables like life stress or involvement with other substances that could have made or increased the likelihood of offending occurring. So even when you account for those, this relationship is still present. And so with both the work we have done as police, with the CHDS findings, really I guess the main takeaway is that there are 2 different sort of populations that have been used in 2 different research designs, but they have found in this case quite similar types of results, and especially with the CHDS using far more variables than police have access to, I think further sort of strengthens those. And then moving on, and now that we'd found that there was a difference between the comparison group and the meth group, focused on what is the meth group doing? Are they all the same? We used latent profile analysis, or LPA, for this, which is all about sort of using variables that you've observed to try and find sort of unobserved groups, sort of profiles, sort of grouping people together to make them statistically as similar as each other in a particular group, but that group is then as different as possible from any of the other ones. It's quite an iterative type of analysis where you basically treat at the beginning everyone is just belonging to the one group. It generates some fit statistics to help you sort of measure how fit the model is. And then as you test and add more groups, you measure that against your fit statistics, as well as sort of theory or how sort of interpretable or useful these different models are getting, until eventually either there is no more use adding groups, either through the statistics saying actually you're getting diminishing returns or no returns at all, adding more groups or splitting into more groups, or they just make absolutely no sense. So with that in mind, we tested things up to about 8 different models, but ultimately decided that a 5 profile or 5 group model was the best, which I will go over. So I first start with saying that in terms of types of offending, every group that I will discuss were involved in some degree with effectively every type of offending, but there did then seem to be key differences. So for example, the first sort of group is around 326 people, which is about 1% of the meth cohort, so quite small. But those 326 people committed a third of all of the dealing of drug offences that were committed by the entirety of the meth cohort. It's quite a small number of people doing a vast amount. This group also experienced relatively low victimizations overall, and they were about in the middle when it came to the harm caused. Subgroup 2 was again quite a small one at 239 people. This group was far more mixed in terms of offending and then some non-crime incidents. In particular, this group of 239 people were involved in a quarter of all of the mental health incidents of the meth cohort. They were also the most highly victimized group, and they were quite low on the amount of harm they caused. So again, these people seem to be more involved with police for other reasons rather than just their offending. The third group was the largest, the majority of the cohort, around 23,000, and these people seem to be involved more in not that many in, I guess, sort of offences or incidents as individuals, and then what they are involved in is quite low, but putting them all together made it quite high. But as a group, they, despite being the majority, committed relatively low harm. Actually, they were the lowest harm group. So again, yeah, a lot of people not doing too much, and what they are doing is lower harm than other people in the meth cohort. The fourth group was the second largest at around 4,300, so about 15% of the cohort. But even still, again, that sort of 15% committed just about or just over 40% of all of the offences of the meth cohort. So again, small number of people doing a lot. And this group was also tied with subgroup 5, to talk about, with the highest harm. So again, what these people are involved with is far higher harm. They did have a lot of, again, generalised sort of offending in that they were involved in pretty much everything, but there was a slight higher, I guess, sort of focus on sort of acquisitive crime like theft and burglary, as well as public order or public disorder offences and property damage. And then the final group, again, was a very, very small one, 208 people. Again, that 208 people really sort of focused on fraud and committed about a third of all of the fraud offences of the wider cohort. As I mentioned, they were also tied as the highest harm group along with subgroup 4. So it's these two groups that are doing the most harmful sort of things. And then subgroup 5, I think, was also quite low on the victimizations compared to the rest of the subgroups. So really, I guess what all that sort of means or is useful is in really to try and get across the point that in order to effectively intervene with people involved with methamphetamine and to target the harm caused by them, we're probably going to need different approaches and not treat everyone the same. In terms of the sort of final main analysis that we decided that instead of looking at the trajectory of everyone, that it would be useful to just take a subgroup of them so we could better control for time, so that everyone that we'd be looking at in this section would have sort of similar sort of time periods to offend, similar social influences at that same sort of time. So in discussions with our steering group, we decided on taking individuals from this methamphetamine cohort who were born between the 1st of January 1990 and the 31st of December 1994. This analysis is all descriptive. It's not statistical. It's just presenting trends. Just need to be aware of that. And I guess the reason, or part of the reason why we decided on this particular time period is due to some of the evidence from our steering group and from the sort of stock take that Jane mentioned, was that methamphetamine seemed to be becoming more prevalent in New Zealand in sort of the late 2010s. And so we're sort of thinking, well, if these people are roughly sort of teenage adolescents at that time, they might be more likely to be engaging in a new drug. And then in terms of sort of the 90s cohort, as it were, and most of them did seem to start coming to police attention as offenders around sort of aged 12 to 17. There were some people that were slightly earlier, some quite later, but that was sort of the more typical time frame which we would expect. If I looked at it by the subgroups that I just had, we found that those involved in the sort of dealing, mental health type things, the sort of very high harm group seemed to come to police attention a bit earlier than the other two subgroups, but it wasn't a huge difference in terms of when they were coming to attention. It was still within that sort of time frame. So part of what we calculated for this was to figure out for every individual when the year of their first sort of methamphetamine offence was, or at least the first one police have a record of, and then use that as a date to try and figure out, right, how much, what happened before that date, what was happening after it. So this top figure is specifically looking at the number of offences or victimisations or incidents for this group. The general trend is that people seem to start offending and start being victimised quite early before we have a record of them engaging with methamphetamine. Because up to that point, they have their first methamphetamine offence. A lot happens in that single year, and then after that point, it does start to decrease. And then on the bottom figure, the harm follows the same typical or same trend. But a limitation of this is that the trend is quite dependent on when we sort of finished, I guess, sort of collecting or analysing the data, which the data goes up until mid-2021. So, and then also we found a lot of people in this cohort were typically having their first methamphetamine offence around sort of 2016 to 2020. So that was about 68%. So a large number of these people not really engaging with methamphetamine as far as we know, till quite near the end of our data. So I would expect that if we did this again in any point in the future, this trend probably wouldn't exist. But in saying that, I did look at this both for the entire methamphetamine cohort, as well as a cohort of those born in the early 80s, and this exact same trend was found there. So I guess indicating that at least the time component is not the entire thing that is going on here. And then I guess just some limitations of the police data, or just sort of this stage as a whole. As I showed, the beginning, police quite limited in the data or fields that we had, so we couldn't include any sort of socioeconomic, personality, or personal type of variables in this data. So the police side of the analysis could not really determine what other sort of factors might be involved in these associations. So we had to more lean on the Christchurch Health and Development Study side. It was also not possible in this data set that we used to determine whether individuals, as I said, have been using methamphetamine or if they'd ever used it. So it's not looking at the causes, just what is an association. And that partly also means, again, as we focused on instances where police had sufficient evidence to prove that someone had committed an offence. So specifically in regards to sort of methamphetamine, it is entirely possible that there are individuals in either the methamphetamine cohort or the comparison cohort from the first analysis that could have committed more offences that police were not aware of or that they were unable to sort of prove. And then in case of the CHDS, there was sort of a limitation there of it was self-reported, so perhaps they were not reporting everything they were involved in. But that is sort of, I guess, a limitation of all self-report things, not just the CHDS. And then finally, sort of main limitation was this data didn't have any sort of indication if there were periods that individuals were not in the community, so whether they were incarcerated at particular times, whether they were involved in treatment programs, for example. So just like so to be aware of that, there are times people might not have been around and we can't capture that. But in terms of this police analysis, what does it exactly sort of mean? I think, I guess, again, it comes back to it provides quite strong sort of case that individuals who have committed methamphetamine offences seem to be quite prolific sort of offenders who are causing a significant amount of harm in our communities, but they were also being severely harmed themselves. And then while they are coming to police quite early, they are persistently seeming to offend and be victimised across time. So while it's not going to be possible to identify every offender who's going to engage in methamphetamine offending, it does sort of highlight that early prevention is quite key, and that if we can prevent people from engaging in sort of antisocial or criminal behaviours in the first place, it will also have an impact of preventing methamphetamine offending specifically. If early prevention is not going to be possible or it's not sort of successful, then again, interventions that are based on sort of best evidence, whilst also being targeted or tailored for particular individuals, particular groups, are going to have the best sort of chance of helping to transition these people into sort of more pro-social lifestyles. Although we don't, in this research, have any, I guess, sort of evidence for what are the exact sort of mechanisms or reasons that people are starting their offending or are continuing it and becoming involved in things like the drug trade with methamphetamine. So that would also require further research. And really, yeah, there's more work to be done.